The year is 2002. After a lethargic period of time caused by ill-conceived decisions, Mortal Kombat made a somewhat triumphant return to form with the new Deadly Alliance release, which brought about a different style of play while retaining the gory violence that had been the series' trademark. Well, I guess you could call it a triumphant return, since following that game, there have been a number of sequels, a web series, a DC crossover thing, but we're not here to talk about any of those. Instead, we're going to look at Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks for the original Xbox, also available for PlayStation 2. Released in 2005, Shaolin Monks was another attempt at trying to make a side game for the Mortal Kombat series. After the failed attempts that were Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero and Mortal Kombat Special Forces. And while Shaolin Monks didn't exactly lead to a new series of side games for the franchise, what with Midway's financial troubles and all at the time, it was still a far better attempt at broadening the mythology of Mortal Kombat than the game bearing said word. And some of that action did carry over to the conquest mode of the subsequent Mortal Kombat Armageddon, so it made a mark of sorts in the short term at least. Shaolin Monks is a retelling and restructuring of the Mortal Kombat 2 story that begins shortly after the end of the first Mortal Kombat tournament, where the entire island is shaking and destroying itself and all that jazz and you have to escape it. And then they more or less follow the story of the second game. Emphasis on more or less. There's quite a few liberties taken with the storyline, such as most of the characters looking quite different from their original arcade appearances, as well as the overall narrative skewing somewhat from established lore. While some sticklers of canon might throw a fit, some of the changes, or maybe they did not, I don't know. As long as they tell a compelling story, I don't mind the liberties taken. Besides, the timeline gets nuked in a couple games anyway, so none of this really matters, but I digress. But you set that piece of business aside, and what do you get? Well, you get a somewhat free-roaming beat-em-up game where you could choose to play as either Liu Kang or Kung Lao for the entirety of the story, or you could partake in a two-player campaign where both characters are involved and open up some other potential paths that would otherwise be closed off to a single-player game. Each character has their set of special moves that they could pull off and upgrade to stronger variants, as well as some combos that they can execute for damage and stuff. Combos are vital in earning experience points to upgrade your abilities, as well as building your fatality meter, which will enable you to pull off a finishing fatality finisher via appropriate button combination. Later down the road, you'll eventually be able to perform screen-clearing mutalities and enter brutality mode, which is a temporary boost of power. Good times, I tell you. In addition to the combat portions of the game, there's also platforming and puzzle-solving segments where you have to navigate environmental hazards and find means of unlocking certain pathways to advance further into the game, usually involving killing enemies in certain ways to open up a path somewhere. There are also alternate paths that will lead to hidden secrets such as gallery items and other goodies, and to encourage multiplayer fun, there are some paths that require two players to unlock, and the co-op aspect is certainly something that shines in what is essentially an open-world beat-em-up, because there is backtracking as you bounce around from area to area, and you eventually learn new moves that will give you access to places you couldn't quite reach before. Of the three spin-off Mortal Kombat games to have been released, Shaolin Monks is probably the best of the bunch. I'd say by default, but even if the other two games weren't such total dumpster fires, this is a genuinely great and enjoyable little brawler, with two distinct characters to play with, each with their own set of moves and fatalities that you could learn and pull off, the team-up mechanics that makes the two-player gameplay worthwhile, and the somewhat open-ended nature of the game allowing for players to uncover secrets stashed and unlock certain features. And speaking of the things you could unlock, the ability to play as Scorpion and Sub-Zero in the main campaign, as well as unlocking a couple more fighters for the game's versus mode, which is nowhere near as nuanced as the fighting game line, but still fun for a lark. And should you complete the secret smoke missions, you'll unlock a playable version of Mortal Kombat 2 in all its glory, albeit with no options to toggle, so expect a bit of an ass whooping if this is your first time going in. Shaolin Monks has some straightforward controls with 3 buttons for attacks, jumping, and pulling off your special trademark moves can be done with the press of a button while holding the right trigger, which is essentially your modifier. Eventually you'll learn combos and fatalities, and you have a helpful move list that details how to pull these off. Control is generally solid, responsive, functional, no lag for the most part. A bit of a learning curve, sure, but the game will drop helpful pointers reminding you how to do things so you're not completely lost. Oh, there are pitfalls, no pun intended. There are times when the camera is a bit of a pain in the ass and unwilling to give you the angle you need for certain segments, and sticking you with angles designed to give you the most disadvantage. Some of the puzzles are perhaps a bit too obtuse, and quite frankly get in the way of the satisfying combat. Also, I understand the desire to encourage multiplayer play by having some secrets require 2 players to unlock, but cutting these off from the solo combatant is still kind of a dick move. And then there's the included Mortal Kombat 2, which is ripped from the Midway Arcade Treasures Volume 2 compilation, which means that certain secrets requiring the use of the start button will not work because start brings up the pause menu, and they never bothered to remap that button to another button on the Duke. It's a bit annoying because you can't do certain tricks, but on the flip side of things, the emulation runs well enough so I can't complain too much. Shaolin Monks is a decent looking game by the standards of the time at least. The characters are a bit plasticky looking at times, the grunts you fight especially, but the main players aren't too bad, whether it's in-game or during the video cutscenes. The environments aren't too bad, a bit drab, but at least there's a bit of variety, and I do like the mild attempts at reimagining some stages from the first two Mortal Kombats as fully realized 3D environments. The special moves look decent, but the fatalities look great. The fatalities in these Mortal Kombat games have always been a highlight, and these are no exception. It's just too bad these got dumped in favor of creative fatality in Armageddon, but that's another story. On the sound department, the only pleasant thing I could say is that the voice acting is adequate. Not award-winning, nothing resembling high-caliber performances or anything like that, but good enough to push the story forward and give off convincing performances as these characters instead of just being bad line reads. Although there are some of those as well, hence why I say adequate voice acting. And the sound effects are their usual crunchy kind of sound effects. But then you have this bland wallpaper music in the background that's been part of these Mortal Kombat games during this period. The sort of hybrid rock and Eastern-styled musical compositions, along with some ambient tracks here and there that are just sort of there and easily forgettable. On the other hand, though, it's been a while since I last touched this game and anything from this period, so maybe they need to grow on me a little more. Maybe not. Well, they say third time's a charm, and after two failed attempts to break away from the fighting game mold, Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks turned out to be the strongest effort in this regard. As a side entry in the franchise, and even as its own little beat-em-up adventure, Shaolin Monks was a fairly entertaining and somewhat engaging little brawler with plenty of moves, plenty of action, a good chunk of secrets, and even a fully playable Mortal Kombat 2 once unlocked, with a couple caveats, that is. It has its faults, no question, but the overall experience is a pleasant one, and the stuff you get to uncover and unlock, if you care for such things, gives the game its extended value. All in all, a superb deviation from the typical Mortal Kombat fare that's well worth checking out.